After 53 years of tyrannical rule, the decades-long grip that the Assad family had on Syria has crumbled in a matter of days. The regime fell under the pressure of a coordinated opposition attack that began on November 27th. Led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the offensive quickly breached the front lines between opposition-held Idlib and neighboring Aleppo. Within 3 days, the coalition seized Aleppo, Syria's second-largest city, and a strategic hub that had been fiercely contested throughout the war. By December 2nd, the dominoes began to fall. Homs, once dubbed the capital of the revolution, succumbed to rebel forces, leaving the road to Damascus wide open. The rebels met little resistance as government forces abandoned strategic positions and retreated to Assad's coastal strongholds in Latakia and Tartus. The swift rebel offensive culminated in their entry into Syria's capital, where they declared victory on state television early Sunday.
إلى من راهن علينا ومن لم يراهن، إلى من ظن يوما أننا كسرنا، نزف لكم من شاشة الإخبارية السورية انتصار الثورة السورية العظيمة بعد 13 عاما من الصبر والتضحيات. لقد كسبنا الرهان وأسقطنا نظام الأسد المجرم، وها نحن نطل عليكم الآن بموجز إخباري من مبنى الهيئة العامة للإذاعة والتلفزيون في العاصمة السورية دمشق. أقدمه لكم أنا يوسف اليوسف. قالت إدارة أو وسائل إعلام محلية إن مئات السوريين يغادرون الأردن عائدين إلى بلادهم بعد إعلان إسقاط النظام. وذكرت الوسائل الإعلامية أن السوريين قدموا إلى بلدهم عبر معبر نصيب الحدودي، مرجحة ارتفاع أعداد الوافدين في الأيام المقبلة. قالت وزارة الدفاع الأمريكية بنتاغون إنها ستواصل الحفاظ على وجود القوات الأمريكية في شرق سوريا. على صعيد متصل، نقلت وسائل إعلام أمريكية عن مسؤول في بنتاغون قوله إن نظام الأسد لا يستحق أن يذرف أو أن يذرف عليه أحد الدموع.
Jubilant crowds pulled down statues of the Assad family, burned banners, and stormed the presidential palace. Reports from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed that government forces had abandoned key positions, including military bases and administrative centers. Opposition fighters stormed the notorious Sednaya prison, freeing thousands of political prisoners in a symbolic act that underscored the regime's collapse.
على سجن سيدنايا. هاي كاميرات السجن يا جماعة كاملة. سجن سيدنايا يا شباب. 8/12/2024. تم بعون الله الاستيلاء على سجن سيدنايا. الله أكبر يا شباب. الله أكبر.
Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazi Jalali remained in Damascus and pledged to oversee a peaceful transition of power, signaling a level of coordination between remaining government officials and the opposition. HTS leadership issued strict orders forbidding attacks on public institutions, aiming to avoid chaos and maintain order. As Damascus fell, Bashar al-Assad fled the country. Moscow confirmed his resignation but did not disclose his location, fueling speculation about his whereabouts. Reports suggest he may have attempted to escape to Russia, but his plane disappeared from radar after making a sudden U-turn. The fall of Bashar al-Assad marks the end of a brutal regime that spanned more than 2 decades and was built on a dynasty that held sway over Syria for over 50 years. Assad's rise to power was as improbable as it was transformative. Born the second son of Hafez al-Assad, a military officer who seized control of Syria in 1970, Bashar grew up overshadowed by his elder brother, Basil, who was groomed to inherit the presidency. While Basil trained as a military commander, Bashar pursued a quieter path, studying ophthalmology in London, far from the political machinations of Damascus. But in 1994, Basil's death in a car crash abruptly thrust Bashar into the role of heir. To prepare him for leadership, Bashar was fast-tracked through military ranks and, following his father's death in 2000, assumed the presidency at the age of 34. his ascension required the Syrian parliament to lower the minimum presidential age, enabling him to take power in an uncontested election. Early in his presidency, Bashar presented himself as a modernizer, ushering in what came to be known as the Damascus Spring. There were promises of economic reform and political openness, and his Western-educated wife, Asma, bolstered the image of a progressive new Syria. However, the reforms were short-lived. Assad's regime quickly reverted to the authoritarian tactics of his father, silencing dissent and consolidating power. The defining moment of Assad's rule came in 2011 during the Arab Spring. While other leaders in the region were ousted by popular uprisings, Assad responded to peaceful pro-democracy protests with a violent crackdown, sparking a civil war that would devastate Syria for more than a decade. His forces deployed chemical weapons, conducted mass imprisonments, and leveled entire cities in their effort to crush dissent. The phrase, Assad, or we burn the country, became a chilling slogan of his regime. The war drew in international powers and turned Syria into a battleground for competing interests. Assad's government was propped up by Russia and Iran, whose military and financial support enabled him to cling to power even as much of the country fell to rebel forces, ISIS, and Kurdish groups. Despite surviving the initial upheaval, Assad's grip on Syria left the nation shattered, with over 12 million Syrians displaced and hundreds of thousands killed. Assad's fall, however, was not due to direct military defeat alone. Years of economic mismanagement, corruption, and the collapse of key alliances undermined his regime. Russia and Iran, distracted by conflicts in Ukraine and Lebanon, offered little aid as rebel forces advanced. Now, as jubilant Syrians tear down the symbols of Assad's regime, his legacy stands as a cautionary tale of authoritarianism. A man once expected to be a healer as an ophthalmologist instead became one of the most notorious figures of modern history, a dictator whose unyielding grip brought untold suffering to his country. The global reaction to the collapse of the Assad regime has been swift and varied, reflecting both relief at the end of decades-long autocratic rule and concerns about the uncertain future of Syria. In the United States, President Joe Biden and his team emphasized monitoring the situation closely in collaboration with regional partners. President-elect Donald Trump took a more provocative tone, attributing Assad's fall to Russia losing all interest in Syria, given its war in Ukraine. Speaking on the platform Truth Social, he said, "Assad is gone. He has fled his country. His protector, Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, was not interested in protecting him any longer. There was no reason for Russia to be there in the first place," Trump wrote. "They lost all interest in Syria because of Ukraine, a war that should never have started and could go on forever. Other Western leaders have broadly welcomed Assad's departure." French President Emmanuel Macron hailed the collapse of what he termed the barbaric state, expressing hopes for peace and unity in Syria, while reaffirming France's commitment to Middle Eastern security. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz called it a positive development. Sir Keir Starmer echoed similar sentiments to his European counterparts. In a press conference this morning, the Italian foreign minister also emphasized the importance of a peaceful transition.
Auspichiamo un passaggio di consegne tra il regime che è caduto e la nuova realtà che sia pacifico, quindi ci sia una transizione politica e non militare. Mi pare che in questo momento le cose vadano in questa direzione. È importante che rimanga l'unità politica della Siria ed è importante altresì, è l'appello che noi lanciamo, che non vengano attaccate le minoranze, a cominciare dalla minoranza cristiana, e che non vengano attaccate le sedi diplomatiche.
In Iraq, a government spokesperson emphasized non-interference, calling for restraint and a focus on Syria's internal sovereignty. Similarly, Iran acknowledged the fall of Assad while calling for national dialogue and a swift end to military conflicts, reaffirming its historical ties with Syria. Jordan's King Abdullah expressed respect for the Syrian people's choices while stressing the need to avoid further chaos and maintain regional stability. Saudi Arabia called for stability and coordination with regional actors to prevent chaos. Qatar reiterated its support for a UN-backed political transition, and Turkey, which has long been a key player in Syria's conflict, welcomed the developments but cautioned against fragmentation and emphasized the need for inclusivity in Syria's new administration. Russia's response was measured. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed Assad's resignation but distanced itself from the negotiations surrounding his departure. Moscow also placed its Syrian military bases on high alert, reflecting ongoing concerns about regional security. Meanwhile, international organizations expressed a mix of relief and caution. The UN pledged support for displaced Syrians and stressed the need to prevent further human suffering.
All armed actors on the ground maintain good conduct, law and order, protect civilians, and preserve public institutions. Let me urge all Syrians to prioritize dialogue, unity, and respect for international humanitarian law and human rights as they seek to rebuild their society.
In Damascus, jubilant Syrians celebrated their newfound freedom, chanting "freedom" and tearing down symbols of the Assad family's rule. They were joined by Syrian diaspora all over the world who took to the streets in their own respective countries to mark this momentous occasion. Many have even claimed that they are finally ready to go back to their homes after facing years of persecution.
The feeling is a bit hard to describe because we've been waiting for this for a long time. I think every Syrian person, every free Syrian person is very overwhelmed and very happy because finally we can say that Syria is a free country now. We deserve democracy. I think Syrian people deserve to live in peace and to live all together as one nation, regardless what is their religion or where they're coming from, how they think. We should all unite today to celebrate that Syria is free.
Wir sind sehr froh, dass Al-Assad für ewig und immer gegangen ist. Also wir freuen uns sehr, dass die Leute von Syrien endlich die Freiheit haben, jetzt ihre Zukunft zu machen und zu ihrem Land zurückzugehen. Also weg in Syrien, weg. Wir sind so froh, einfach so. Wir können nicht auch uns äußern, wie froh wir sind.
Heute kein Gast, heute frei. Nochmal danke Deutschland.
Heute ist der Mauerfall in Syrien. Heute, dieser Tag von heute, gestriger Nacht, hat genau so die Bedeutung vom Mauerfall in Berlin damals. Das ist für uns die Freiheit. Wir danken uns bei Deutschland für das, was sie für das syrische Volk gemacht hat. Und wir gucken in die Zukunft, dass wir auch weiterhin, wenn wir in Syrien sind, weiterhin zusammen friedlich kooperieren.
Endlich sind wir jetzt befreit, also dass der Präsident schon weg ist, Gott sei Dank, nach 13 Jahren. Und wir heute, also schauen Sie da hinten, also das zeigt sich von alleine, was heute, also dass die Leute sich heute feiern und froh sind, dass der Präsident endlich weg ist.
Die Gefühle sind unglaublich, wir glauben das nicht. Wir versuchen zu glauben, dass es wahr ist, weil nach 12 Jahren so viel Leid, unsere Familien freuen sich alle, seit 2 Tagen, wir schlafen nicht. Wir freuen uns einfach, wir wissen aber nicht, was wir fühlen sollen. Wir freuen uns richtig.
بالأول نحن نشكر الشعب اللبناني جميع طوائفه على مساندته ووقوفه معنا، وهاي الفرحة كبيرة والحمد لله رب العالمين. ونشكر طريقة جديدة مكة وطرابلس وعكار بشكل عام. فرحتنا ما بتوصف، ونشكر كل واحد وقف معنا وشاركنا بهذه المرحلة. وبقول كلمة: يا رفيق الحريري، قم من ضريحك وانظر ما جرى، سقط قاتلك ونزف لك البشرى.
الصراحة حرية شخصية، فيك تنزل على سوريا، فيك يعني ما فيك تدفع بدل، ما فيك زيارة قطر بتطول سنة شهرين عشان تطلع، يعني متى ما بدك تنزل على بلدك، يعني انت حر، عرفت كيف حر؟ انا انسان حر.
On est très contents. On est très contents. On est libre. On est libre. On a beaucoup pleuré. Là, ça va mieux. On célèbre tous en communauté. Et on espère pour le mieux. On verra bien. Un renouveau. Un renouveau. On part sur de nouvelles bases, sans tout ça, sans toute cette tyrannie. Et puis, on espère que ça ira bien.
On est vraiment très heureux. C'était vraiment inespéré ce moment-là. On attendait depuis très longtemps. Pas depuis 13 ans, mais même depuis le début du régime, depuis 40 ans. Pour mon cas, en tout cas pour ma famille, depuis 40 ans. Donc c'est un moment rêvé.
سوريا بالأمان بدنا نرجع، وفعلا خاصة الشعب الكردي مظلومين بالسوريا، خاصة الشعب الكردي. أما والله إذا الفرح نحن فرحنا إنه هو راح، أما الباقي يجي ما نعرف هذا بيصير أحسن منه ولا اللي يجي أسوأ منه ما نعرف. بعدين هذا معركة والله للمستقبل ما نعرف.
El día que nos libramos del mayor terrorista que ha habido en la tierra, Bashar al-Assad y su padre, su familia. Nos hemos librado de todos ellos. Siria libre, gracias a Dios.
Whilst the fall of Bashar al-Assad marks a historic turning point for Syria and the Middle East, the country now faces an uncertain and complex future. Despite the collapse of Assad's regime ending more than 5 decades of autocratic rule by the Assad family, the rapid offensive that toppled it has left a fragile and fractured political and social landscape. The rebel forces, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and allied factions such as the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, are now in control of much of the country. HTS has promised inclusivity and a nationalist agenda under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Speaking to rebels, he said the victory was a turning point for the region, and his group pledged to protect minorities and work toward a diplomatic transition, something it has already been seeing to implement after opposition military commanders left Syria's Sayyida Zainab Shia shrine unharmed. Caretaker Prime Minister Mohammed al-Jalali has offered to extend cooperation to any leadership chosen by the Syrian people, signalling a willingness to ensure a peaceful handover of power. Despite these overtures, the possibility of infighting among rebel factions or reprisals against minorities still looms large, threatening the stability of Syria's fragile transition. The immediate challenge is forming a government capable of uniting Syria's diverse population while addressing the deep scars left by over a decade of war. With millions of displaced people, widespread destruction of infrastructure, and a legacy of mistrust among Syria's ethnic and religious communities, the road ahead is daunting. The fall of Assad is also a major blow to Iran and Russia, two of the regime's most steadfast allies. Iran loses a critical ally in its axis of resistance. For Russia, Assad's collapse signals a diminished role in the Middle East, jeopardizing its strategic bases in the country. Both nations, preoccupied with their own crises, Iran with regional tensions and Russia with the war in Ukraine, were unable to prevent Assad's rapid downfall. Meanwhile, the United States views Assad's departure as a mixed blessing. While it weakens adversaries like Iran and Russia, Washington's 900 troops in Syria now face an uncertain mission as President-elect Donald Trump has signaled a preference to withdraw. Such disengagement could leave a power vacuum, further complicating the transition. The next chapter for Syria hinges on whether it can overcome its divisions and establish a government that represents all Syrians. The possibility of a new democratic era exists, but the country's factions still wield their weapons, and the potential for renewed violence is real.
I was a bit surprised by how quick this happened. I didn't expect that it would only take 10 days from them leaving Idlib and then arriving in Damascus, but that there was strong regime weakness and that there was a strong weakness of Assad supporters. We could clearly see this, and I think Syria experts knew that something was coming, even though I guess most are also surprised by how dynamic and how fast and how quick this all unfolded. The Jabhat al-Nusra in the past, and especially Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which operates under this name since 2017, is more Syria-oriented. It is less transnational, it is less concerned about establishing an Islamic caliphate. It wants to establish an Islamic order, but under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani since 2017, it has tried in the northwest region of Idlib, over which it ruled mostly 3.5 to 4 million people. It has tried to assure minorities living there, Christians, other religious minorities, for them to have a role and to not be persecuted. It doesn't mean that there haven't been violence against opposition. It was an authoritarian rule. It was not a democratic, liberal, secular kind of rule. Certainly not. But it was not the same kind of dictatorship or the same kind of brutal repression that we know in Syria from regime areas, that we have known from ISIS rule, or that we have known from the Turkish occupation of parts of northern Syria. So it is an ambivalent organization.
The fall of Assad is not the end of Syria's challenges, but the beginning of a critical period of transition. The stakes are high, and the choices made now, by both Syrians and the international community, will shape the nation's future for generations to come.